So now we're going to continue with designing the terrain. So going back into the terrain editor, editing the function, we're going to take a look at what we can do not only to add finer details, but modify sizes and create kind of stepping, and also some of the other nodes that are going to work well for this, and some of the other noises we can use. So taking a look at one thing in particular, we are using the same clipping method and the smooth clip filter for every single node or every noise. Now, because of this, the size differences around the edges is going to be more of a reduction. And if you want to have a more consistent edge on everything, what you'll need to do is adjust your contrast and brightness to compensate for the scaling differences. So with the first square being clipped, there's a very large area that has a fall off and that smooth variation. And as we start moving to the other nodes, that area is reduced. So if you need to reduce contrast amounts or increase them, depending on the style and the look you're going for, you can make changes to the individual contrast amounts and brightness amounts. Because the clipping is set to 0, the map node should not need to be modified at all. You can get some very extreme values. You can, of course, go higher than the slider amount. I just typed in a value of 500, no problems. We can also go into the negatives in order to reverse any of these shapes. Now, if you're seeing a very flat preview in the output observer, it is dependent, well, depending on the version you're working with, it will be dependent on the scale of the terrain. So you may not see all of the elevation, and you may not be able to pick out some of the details or see any errors. If that is the case, because we are using the auto fit mode, which does work the best because it will keep within the range, what you can do is check on only when saturated, or when saturating, and turn it off right away. So just kind of turn that on and off will allow you to extend the terrain to the full view of the output observer. We could also choose to use a different map or color map if we wanted to, in order to see details for different elevations. That you can do for version 7 and up. Possibly version 6 has that ability to modify in the terrain editor this altitude color and also have it update within the function editor. Not quite sure if version 5. You'll have to see. It really depends on the version. But you can modify this color map. It won't be identical to what's going to show within the terrain editor because of the way the scales are set up and the way force extensions are used in order to display the terrain. So if you wanted to, you could load a color map and go through different color maps. This is part of the ASLFX color map preset collection. So I could choose one of these if I wanted to see different color variations or define different altitudes. You can also go through the presets that come with view. There's some different terrain editor maps available. So if you did want to view it differently, you could easily change that. And I just loaded in one that I use for explosions. And I'm going to edit the color map. and as we make changes, it does update. I'm going to go ahead and brighten that up a little bit. And just modify these values just to get something that works a little better. Once again, version dependent, it does sometimes matter. There may, or you may only see the first half of the color map within the function editor, and everything above this halfway point may not show up. So you may only need to modify the first half. That is version dependent. Different versions handle that information differently. We'll just create something here to define some of these areas a little bit better. And then we can edit the function. And then once we check only when saturating, turn it on and off, we can see all of those details. And this is a little more clipped out of a color, not so many transitions and gradients. That way we can see a little bit better the final output. So let's go and take a look at modifying and pulling out some of the finer details by adjusting the smooth clip variation. Now you could make changes to this and add it into the main part of the function with another combiner before it reaches the other combiners. Or you could have different sections you want to connect to or design special node variations. But one of the easy ways to modify the scales so that they fit together, so we could maybe pick up an edge or create some, sort of a beveled in edge or inset on a specific set of blocks or surfaces, is by modifying that contrast and also the brightness. If you want to keep your bevel edges the same size, brightness is going to be one of the probably better ways to go than the contrast. But filtering the same noise is really going to be the only way to keep the shape aligned correctly, because modifying the scale, it's going to have a continuous offset of the entire surface. It's not scaling the individual squares, it's scaling the entire noise. But with the smooth clip, we can scale the entire, or each individual block by adjusting the contrast. So it gives us the ability to create multiple variations, or even sort of a builder we can use. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste that clipping and the map, and that gives us a connection here where we can modify the smooth clip in order to adjust scale, so whether or not we want to shrink it in or increase it. So I'm going to increase the contrast. We could bring it up to 5. Actually, I will go ahead, just at this time, keep it at 4, and just modify that brightness from 0 to 1. So we have the shape shrinking and the square shrinking down a little bit. Once again, because the map or the output clip is the same, the map doesn't need to be set. In the function node preview, anytime you're extending beyond 1, if the automatic extension is turned on, the extension that shows up next to it will have a number higher than 1, whether it's in the negative or the positive. It won't let you know. You really have to look at the graph or the output in order to know whether or not it's negative or positive, but it will tell you the extension amount it's going over 1. So that's a really nice indicator. So automatic extension, very nice. So what we want to do is combine these together to get a nice variation. And to really see which we're working with here, I'm going to go ahead and change the size and then set it back. So we can tell that these larger, and what would be the big orange blocks are connected to this node. So then we know what to look at when we're making changes to make sure things are matching up correctly. So just doing a quick shift of the origin or the wavelength and setting it back gives you a good idea of exactly what part you're working on, because it can get a little complex when you have all of these different nodes showing up. So what we can do is modify and mix these together before it reaches the combiner. So we're going to add in the combiner node. By default, because I've closed out the editor, the last one selected doesn't no longer applies, so it is going to create the default, which is a blender node. So we could use a blender and blend them together, or use the combiner. The blender does have some additional options that the combiner doesn't have, like the subtract. But there are certain ones that are only available in either or. So let's use the combiner, and we're going to combine both of these. We don't want to use the addition mode, not in this case. But we can modify offsets and start to bring out, you can see that lower edge showing. So by setting this to the minimum mode, and you can start to see it in the node preview, where that extension is being created and adding a sort of inner area, an intersection, and we can also modify the amplitude. And now this is creating more of walls around the edges. If we're reversing it, it's going to create a different type of bevel. With this, I would probably want to go in to the clip and maybe reduce the brightness a little bit more to give us a larger area or a larger edge. When we zoom out, we can see that being applied throughout the function. Going back to the combiner, I'm going to set the amplitude to 1 and just pull out that halfway point so that we just have a little bit of a step going in. If you notice too many spikes showing up because of the different scales, you may want to blend this differently or adjust that size. Once again, using the smooth clip filter works really well to change that size. We could also go into the max mode and modify our offsets and amplitudes to have more variation. In this case, we're going to have some with input 1 being the original, the larger squares, offset -1, and then default values for everything else. Because the noise itself has a randomness to it, not every single square is going to have that beveled edge, so that does give us more variation. So you can see some of them are not being subtracted and some of them are. So that's a nice little variation you can add to it. We could also combine those together and create even more variation within the same shape, or extend beyond with some of the other functions. I'm going to change this to -1.5 for the brightness instead of -2, because I did see some smaller areas that were extruding out and didn't quite look right. Now, if you want to create a nice reusable, more advanced function, what you can do is take these filters that we have and create a meta node out of them. And then you could copy that over to the other sections. You could also go in and create new outputs. So the combiner that we have as the current output, I'm going to call the mix. And then if we want to still be able to extract those individual elements, what we can do is right-click, add an output node, and this is a double output, which is a numeric. Vector 3 is the red vector, XYZ. Vector 2 is for texture coordinates, so X and Y, the purple line that shows up when you're editing materials. And the color output is the green connection. So we're going to use the double output, and it'll add in a new output that we'll see once we close out the meta node, or you can actually work with these with the meta node open and still having the other function together. You can once you click back in the other function, it may close out the meta node depending on the changes you're making. But my screen size while I'm recording isn't really large enough to work with that efficiently right now. But typically I do have two monitors set up where I'll keep meta node maybe open on one monitor and then still have the complete function open on the other. So if we want to still be able to access the other connections, we can add another output node, double output, connect it to that map. So we're going to say this is our smooth clip. That was our first one. So we're going to say large and small, and then click OK. And now we have a meta node that's going to have multiple outputs. So we're currently connected to that mix. If I was to disconnect that combiner and go to reconnect to the meta node, we can now choose from the mix, the large, or the small function. So if you connected this to all of these different connections and removed the current smooth clips or maps, you would get a lot more variation, a lot more options to kind of piece together these individual noises. So I'm going to reconnect that to the mix and select that meta node, and we can call this, give it a name. We can also save it out so you can reload it at any time to add this to your functions. And I'm just going to call this square filter, and then we can see that name show up for the meta node. I'm going to go ahead and save this out in the current state. Also go ahead and increase our size so we can see some of the variation in scale of the different buildings. So you can load this in version 8.4 and higher, city function 2. And go back and we can continue to modify this. Now if you want to add this connection to the other ones and replace what you currently have, there are different ways you can do this. One is to select the meta node, click the link, and or actually what you would need to do is copy it and paste it. That will work. And set up a new connection. Or I'm going to actually connect that to the large, which was the original, because I don't want to change it just yet. And the other way we can do that is to save this out. And this will open your metanode folder in the installation directory for the content. And I'm going to call this square filter version 0.1 and start with 0.1. Now, this metanode folder also has additional folders named for each type of node, or some of the different nodes. If there isn't a folder for a specific node group, you can create a new folder with that name, and it'll show up in the interface, and you'll see that in just a sec. So let's say the dynamics folder was not added or is not part of the installation. You can create a new folder, a new directory called dynamics, and as long as it matches that node type, it will show up, and we'll see that in view. So what I'm going to do is go to the filter, because we've created a filter, and now these are all from Snowflake, the metanode collection version 2, currently at version 2. from ASLFX, which is a huge selection of nodes I've created for a lot of different situations. And I'm going to go ahead and save this in the filters. So save. And now when we right click and we go to filter node, we have a meta node folder, and we can choose, and normally it would be in the list, but I do have a lot of different versions of Vue installed on this system, and I do believe I installed it in the wrong folder, or saved that in the wrong folder, probably the 8.0, and I'm working in 8.5. So I just need to go and save that into the correct directory. So now I'm in my 8.5 directory. I'm going to save it. I'm going to right click, go to filter node, and go to the meta nodes, and we're going to see that square filter show up. So now we can load it in really quickly that way and add it to our connection. And we can just delete the other ones. We can also go over to the left and select to load metanode, and that will open up the last folder you were in or viewing. So we reconnect that to the large variation. And I'll just right click, go to meta nodes, select the square filter, and we can bypass those other filters. Now, because the link is already created, we may be able to just select them and hit delete, and it will automatically keep our connection. So this does create a much cleaner function and gives us more options for mixing together our different nodes. So now we can add to it, or we can start to select from some of these other outputs. If we want to use the mixed ones. Now, I also want to note that if you want to be able to access the commands within the meta node, you need to publish the parameter. And that's actually really easy. All you need to do is go to Edit, to open up the meta node, and anything that can be controlled is going to have a new button next to it, which is the Publish parameter. What that will do is bring these commands available to the main meta node options. And we can also set up different naming. So let's take the brightness, which we were using to control the size of the small square, and we're going to click to publish. We can give it a group name, which is going to be small square. We'll name the group, and we'll call it size. If you want to link in reference to the brightness, you can, so that you remember which part it was from. But you don't necessarily need to. So now we have that small square that we can modify, and we don't need to go back into the meta node to make that change. So now if we want to save this out as a new version, we could save it out as version 0.2, but it will not update the current meta nodes in the other version. So depending on how complex you want it to be, you might want to set that stuff up first, and then you can save out a version that you'll be using frequently and continue with that. So let's go ahead and continue on with adding new noises. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this set square stones with that new square filter in the new version, and we're going to take a look at some of the other options we can use that are going to be square. Now, if we also take a look at some of the other noises, you're going to see some round ones in there. We're going to stay away from rounder shapes at the moment, or circular shapes, although we can add a cylinder to create cylindrical buildings. It is definitely possible. Of course, you'll want to be able to do that. But at this point, it's going to cause, I think, too many problems and create too many bad edges. And you really have to kind of go through and take a look and see what you've got to work with in order to create a good transition. So under the square patterns, we can use squares, stones, or sorry, squares and square stones are going to be basically the main ones. If we go to some of our other patterns here, distributed patterns, we can use square samples 2D, and we need to make a few changes before we can actually benefit from this specific one. So what we need to take a look at is turning off the randomness, which is our overlapping. And our sample amount, currently, or by default, is 4 samples per cell. If we set it to 1 sample per cell, there's a minimal amount of overlapping, really depending on the size. Let's go ahead and turn on Find Maximums in order to see the full size. And then if we reduce the size, 0.5 will pretty much give us our sample, or our total sample size. And let's go ahead and change the scale here to make it even, so it's 2 by 2 for the wavelength. Set our size to 0.5. Now, if we modified the samples so we had 0 to 1, then we're going to have areas that are missing a sample. And you can see that just a couple of blocks showing up, we could do 0 to 4. And now this is a per cell amount, so you really wouldn't need to go too high with it, because if we adjust randomness, you're going to start to see them spread out and overlap. As long as the randomness is set to 0, though, they will stay in that sample area, and you shouldn't run into any problems with kind of strange geometry being created. Scale variations, also something you need to pay attention to depending on which function you're using and which size it is. You can certainly use scale variations. I would suggest reducing the size of the total sample, maybe using 0 to 1 for the amount of samples in order to prevent overlaps. Now we can also set this up so there's 1 sample for every single cell, so there's always going to be one of those squares created. And then we can also change the shape. We could use a cube, which is not necessarily going to have a rounded edge. And since we have a square filter that will take care of the rounded edge to give us a good transition, we can use one of the rounded objects. So we could use a round pyramid, a pyramid tower, round pyramid tower, a couple of different shapes, and you can see in the node preview what they look like, and then how the square filter deals with that. Now, the node preview typically reflects the original double output, which was the mix, so it is going to show us our mixed output. So now if we want to add this to our combiner, let's go ahead and use the mixed variation. And this is going to be input 3, so now we'll start to see that new set of squares showing. So you can see with the overlaps what can happen. In this case, we're just adding to it. It's not going to really cause any issues with creating jagged edges, but if we were to, say, multiply this output, the current output, with something else, we could run into some issues. We do have a few areas that are going to show up like that. So like I was saying before, it's just something you got to pay attention to. We can also set this up to have a random altitude, which is pretty nice. Give us a lot more variation in the look of it. Now the angular variation is going to tilt and rotate around those cells. I'm not going to suggest that. We're going to see some geometry eventually that's going to have some issues, and it's mostly going to be anything that has an angle like that, and especially if it's intersecting with a round edge, and that's because of the way the polygons are created. The polygons are triangles, and if you happen to go in between triangle's facing the wrong direction, you have a sharp edge like that, it's going to be jagged and it's going to look terrible. So I'm going to reduce my scale variations to 0.2, change this over to 0 to 1 samples per cell, change our size to 0.4. So we're just adding all those extra little pieces there. If we go to the combiner, we can choose how we want to add this information in, whether we want to go negative, so we can reverse the output and subtract, or add to it. So a lot of different ways we can control that, and the offset with the add function is only going to modify the output and not the look of the geometry or the look of the terrain. So we could also, I'm not going to switch to a different value at this point just because we do have that other connection in there at the moment. Let's set up negative 0.5. And we'll go into our samples here and change our wavelength a little. Modify our origin to give us a little bit of offset. And then we can also offset the Z in order to change the variation. It's kind of a variation seed. But we are working in the 2D mode, so really the Z doesn't matter in this case. If we were working in the just regular square sample mode, it would modify the variations, or which cell is going to show which sample out of the 0 to 1. So where the zeros are and where the ones are, it will modify that. But the 2D version is much quicker for rendering and processing, so I do want to stick with that because I'm not worried too much about changing that variation at this point. I can change that variation very easily by modifying these other settings and also changing the origin of that node. So let's go ahead and take a look at the current function and building setup. I'm also going to go ahead and save a new version of this. And the more complex this is going to get, the more of these the bad areas are going to start showing up. So I'm going to try to find one. It looks like that might be a problematic area, but we'll have to wait until we render to see. And so far it looks pretty clean. There is a little bit of a strange overlapping over here showing, but it's very minimal. That's hardly going to be a problem. So for the most part, I mean, it's pretty minimal, so there's really not any issues showing up as of yet. So we'll do a render from farther away. Okay, so actually at this point, I mean, it's looking really good. It does seem very clean throughout. I'm not seeing any problematic areas yet. Of course, the more complex it gets, we will end up seeing some errors later, and I can show you some other scene files I've created if we end up, for some reason, creating an almost perfect function. So let's go ahead and we can modify this a little further. If you want to see more of the function, let's create a larger area. We can change that scale to 0.2. In order to match the height, we will need to change that Z scale. But if we want to see a little bit more of what's going on, now we will need to add larger variation functions within here so that every single building isn't exactly the same size. We want to have taller buildings, smaller buildings, and we can do that with combining different terrains and also modifying the functions. Now, rendering this from the back, there are some areas and a few things that do look a little strange. And that is, if you take a look, these darker strips that are showing up, because of the vertical geometry there and the way the diffusion amounts are setting up, we are going to see those strips going throughout. Now, depending on the mix and the variation, finer details, sometimes those can really change around a lot and start to look a little strange. But for the most part, I think that's something that can be dealt with because obviously we don't have any defined material on this yet. It's just a very basic color. So still, for the most part, I think it looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and take a look at some additional options we can use to create variations. Go back and edit the function, and I want something that's going to be a little bit larger to mix with the current function. Also, depending on the version you're using, you may need to match your scale for the output observer to the material scale in the terrain editor, where I have it at, I believe I set it to 0.2. As it was 0.2 for the scale for the altitude production, which in version 8.5 that I'm using right now is showing that scale in the output observer, but in other versions, in previous versions, it may be that scale of 1. So you may need to go into that scale and manually change it in order to actually see the entire function. So let's go through and create a larger scale variation that we can subtract from this in order to add a different amount of size to these buildings. So first I'm going to go ahead and add in a combiner just underneath the current combiner. And we want to pick something that we're going to use for our variation. We can use square samples, keeping in mind that the more we use square samples, the longer it's going to end up taking to render when we have massive functions with them. Really more of a problem with rendering the materials in that. But I am going to go ahead and add another variation of it, and we can connect our combiner. Let's select the large version. And we can already see by adding, it has created variation, but I do want to modify some of our scales. So let's create this a little bit bigger. Let's take our overall scale, set it to 12, wavelength 4, our Y we'll set to 3. And we do have random altitudes on. We could turn that off if you want to have a more defined size. That is going to have less variation overall and give you groups of similar sized buildings. So some buildings will be much larger and those will be equal throughout in their size, or the random altitudes will give you variations throughout the entire function. So whichever one you think ends up looking the best. I'm going to turn off random altitudes for this one. And I think that works pretty good as a start. If we want to continue to use the add, we can, or we can modify this to subtract, modify offsets, or pick a different mode in order to clip out the current function. And depending on what you end up with the combination modes, you may want to use that randomness, the random altitudes. It may end up looking better, depending on how many small elements are being cut from the function. If we take a look at multiply, now we do have an area. It looks like a very flat zone that is giving us a value of 0, which is going to completely flatten out the terrain, completely flatten out that function. So if you need to offset it in order to get that detail back, we now have a very thin layer with some nice details. And then if we offset it even more, we create a reverse part of the function because we're multiplying it in opposite directions. So a lot of different ways we could use this. We could even set up a lot of or another combiner to the same exact output and just use a different combination mode to get a variation. You can see, really, depending on how you want to clip it, there's a lot you can do. You can also just blend them together. So blending the multiple functions, which is going to give us a direct output. It's going to display every part of this function. Nothing will be cut out, and it's just going to blend with the current function. And add kind of does that too, but in a different way, because it will extend already high areas instead of just laying them over on top of each other. So this is more of a layering mode as opposed to an addition mode. So I'm going to use the add mode and just stick with the defaults. So 1 and 0, 1 for the amplitude, 0 for the offset. I also want to show you another technique you can use to create lines. So instead of having squares, if you want to create a line, one way you could do it is if you increase the wavelength to a really high amount. So if we increase the x to 50, we can stretch that out very large. The only thing and the only problem with this is that because we have smooth areas, those smooth areas are being stretched with it. So it's going to create very large gradient sections to create ramps. Now if that's what you want, because that is definitely useful, then you can use it. You can see this ramped area over here, a very smooth transition to it. But if you want to have a line and a continuous line for each square, you can remove the vector completely and set it to 0. So now we're adding in lines value on the x or along the y. Zoom out here where you can see it a little bit better. So if I switch it between 4, where we can see the separations, and setting it now to 0, we end up with lines. And you can also do that for the y-axis. And it'll create these very long strips of lines. So that's a cool way to just remove a vector completely and have any of these become aligned option. So that'll work with just about anything. Setting the z to 0, the only thing that does is removes your ability to modify its vector, or the origin. Whenever you do have the wavelength at 0, the origin is completely null. You can modify that. So if I set the wavelength 4 to 0, this origin no longer applies. Actually, it looks like it does in this case on the x, but on the z it will not. And I'll show you that on a different node here. So if I change this noise node to 25 and set the z to 0, it does look like it's still working, and that is because the vector itself is still or hasn't yet been modified by the vector operation, vector transformation, which is going to be part of the material and not this part. So actually, I won't be able to show that to you just yet. So we will keep that at 1. And that does affect more of roughness operations in the terrain. I've noticed that more in the terrain fractal. The second output for the rough areas, if you set that to 0, that changes the scale of it. And we're not really going to get into that entirely, but just to let you know that if you do notice a change, that could possibly be the reason why. So there are other ways we can modify this besides just using noises. We can use some different filters once we have this output in order to create edges and fine-tune this. One way is to use a direct filter. You just need to be careful that you aren't creating any spikes with it. But it is a cool way to be able to modify this overall output. If you do want to limit what happens to the numbers going below 1 or above 1, you can adjust the clamping mode, whether it should continue. So any value over 1, should it continue? Or should it mirror the filter? Or should it repeat the filter? Repeat will create a very harsh cutoff. Mirror is a pretty smooth transition. We'll just stick with continue. We can also go through absolute wave. Creates a pretty interesting look, although it can also create very spiky areas. So you need to use it wisely. And you really want to pay attention, kind of zoom in, and look at the way the geometry is being affected by it. And although it does really create some great looking outputs a lot of the time, it can also cause some huge issues for creating spiky zones. Lots of very flat areas. It's just kind of the nature of it. Minimal contrast to reduce that. Right now we see an outline around the outer edges. One way to also kind of prevent that from happening is using this more than once and using a blender to kind of combine the outputs of a minimal and a larger reduction, kind of like we did with the square filter that was created. You can also reduce that contrast and the brightness, but it just gives a lot of extra details. That's one of the filters that I've been using for this type of function. It creates a very nice outline for edges, but is going to definitely cause problems. Saw wave, you're going to want to stay away from. Although it may look good in the overall preview of the function itself, what it will do is create probably some of the worst edges you'll ever see, because it's a repeating filter. Once it reaches a high point, it just cuts off completely. We'll lose all of those transitions that we created the square filters for in order to create. So certain ones you want to stay away from, but there are some that also create some really nice variations. Gaussian can be useful, but you want to use it efficiently, because right now we have some very large spikes showing because we're basically cutting out too much, and it will create very fine, thin lines. But this can also be useful for removing artifacts. If we were to take and combine this using another combiner, take this variation and subtract it from another. So a lot of different things we can do with it. Parabolic is really useful. I like using the parabolic on this because it will give some very nice transitions and allows you to really get in to the function and modify it a little bit more without having to add additional nodes. You can get better variations of height. But anytime you're modifying these outputs like this with some of these filters, you're going to run into some of the spikes. And we can see that in some of the areas. We'll go ahead and take a look and see how this is going to turn out. Do you want to switch to the main camera view? And you can see some of those spiky areas do have flat tops, which makes it okay to work with. But there's going to be other areas that may not transition as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at this function. And there aren't really any huge, clear, obvious areas that have problems. There's a section up here that looks like it could get worse. But since we don't have any really fine details yet in this, it really looks like everything's, for the most part, been optimized pretty well with the different nodes we're using. So that does seem to work okay. And if you're not getting a good preview from farther away on the surface, you may just need to zoom in closer in order to see the geometry. It looks like this might be a spiky area in here that is not flat on top. Just want to check that out. With the render, it looks fine. So it's a good idea to take a look at a render every once in a while to really make sure whether or not the spikes are a real just flat area. And what I mean by a spike is where you have, instead of a polygon that is flat, what you end up with is the points on top of that polygon and then everything else below it, so that you have this thin line. And we just want to avoid those thin lines because they're going to show up terrible in renders.